Hello dear friends, once again a very warm welcome at Lit ECT, the channel which serves your need regarding English literature. Okay friends, in this class we are going to discuss some important terms related with post-colonial theory. As you all know, post-colonial studies is a very reputed field of inquiry and literature and critical analysis in for the last I say 5 or 6 decades. In fact, it is now one of the established fields in literature which writers and critics are spread across the globe. So I have brought in this video certain terms which are very important in this discourse. Okay, the very first term which we will discuss is abrogation. Okay friends, abrogation, literal meaning is the abolition of some law or agreement. Okay, it is its literal meaning. Now post-colonial writers use this as a metaphor to denote a strategy to show their rejection of the standard or pure syntax of the English language. You know very well, English has been the language used by European and especially British colonizers, and its supremacy, its hegemony is established in all the colonies. There are several, in fact, if we go to a background, there are several responses to this dominance of the imperial language. Two most important tools of the decolonizing process, first is rejection of the English language and second is subversion of the colonizer language. Okay, there are now two ways to revolt. First is to reject English language completely and second is to use it but subvert it according to our needs. On one hand, we have post-colonial writers like Ngugi who considers English language as an instrument of colonization, the most important vehicle through which that power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. In fact, they call it like a bomb which exploded, which completely destroyed the native language, the native tradition, and that is why Ngugi, after initial works, chose to write in his native language. There are many other writers like him which are in the favor of completely shunning, completely rejecting the English language. However, there are other set of writers and thinkers like Rajarao, Mulk Rajanand, Chinua Achebe, and later next generation of post-colonial writers, diasporic writers, who believed that the imperial language can be made, this is very important quotation, bear the burden of the native experience. What it exactly means, that as colonizers has brought English language into the colonies, now this language has to take the burden of the native experience also. Or in simple words, we can say these writers, these thinkers believe that the colonized, the subject can use the English language for its own advantage to subvert the colonial discourse. Rajarao, in very famous lines in Kanthapura, his famous novel, he writes, one had to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is one's own. This is a sort of dilemma. The language which is not one's own, that is English language. Spirit, that is one's own. We cannot write like the English. The English writers write in English in a different way. The post-colonial, the colonized subject write in English in a different way, and we should not. We cannot write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the larger world as a part of us. To reach out to the world, to make them what the native feel, what the colonized feel, we cannot close ourselves into our native languages. We have to use the English language but in a different manner, and this is all about abrogation. So Bill Ashcroft, Griffith and Tiffin, they were the first who advocated this strategy in their canonical work. The Empire Writes Back in these words: post-colonial literary language has to seize the language of the imperial center and replace it in a discourse fully adapted to the colonized place. This is the main mantra, this is the main code, that displacement of colonial language with the colonized language, though the medium, the language is English, but its context is completely changed. This happens first by an abrogation or refusal of the normative standards of the imperial culture, the standards of the correct grammar, syntax and pronunciation. Okay, what they are trying to say is that though we write in English, we means the post-colonial subject write in English, but it doesn't mean totally imitating, copying the language. It means changing the syntax according to their own need. It means using their own idiom, using their own we can say particular native words, what Salman Rushdie later called chutneyfication. It is quite related with the abrogation. Abrogation here, it means that we are violating the purity of English language. We are not following the structure which is considered to be the normal, or which is considered to be the proper structure or grammar. When the colonized began to use the language of the colonizer, that is English, different forms of English appeared: Indian English, African English, Canadian language. And when we have different varieties of language, we cannot be sure the standard code of the narrative, we can easily reject it. Power of the imperial language, which the power which once it had over all the colonies, it was a powerful tool hitherto. This power becomes subverted because the colonized subject begin to use this language according to his or her understanding, according to his or her background, according to his or her native idioms, and there is a mixture. There is in colonizers term, impurity enters into the pure terrain. Cross-cultural writers like Rushdie, Achibi do not use standard English but assert their identity through language variants. Rushdie, for example, uses songs for Hindi movies into his sentences. Achibi uses Igbo proverbs in the novels. There are so many examples. There are writers like Tutuola who changes the spelling in the very title of their novel. Instead of calling it drunkard, they use word drinkard. There are so many examples where we find that the normal, what is considered to be the normal structure and syntax, it is violated, it is abrogated by the post-colonial writers. In this way, the domination of the imperial power has been done away with by using their own language but not adhering to its purity. This is the funny thing about it. They are using the very language which was used to set a priority, which was used to set a hegemony, which was used to dominate, but now we are using it by violating its purity. Even writers intentionally change the standard spellings or punctuation to assert the native element in the colonizer's language. So I hope now you get the meaning of abrogation. In very simple meaning terms, it is violating the normal structure, the syntax, the spelling, the punctuation rule of the English language, using English language but according we can say a chalk, a tadka, a chutneyfication of that language. Okay, coming to our next term, which is quite related with abrogation, is appropriation. Now, this term is, as I have already mentioned, usually employed in conjunction with the term abrogation. In fact, abrogation and appropriation always go hand in hand together. It refers to the strategies employed by the post-colonial writers using the linguistic and academic tools introduced by the colonizers for subverting the colonizers' version of the truth. Now, what is basically appropriation? Appropriation is a process. It is a sort of hybridization. It is the process in which the native inserts its version of truth into the European or the colonizer's version of truth. It is not just we can say changing of syntax or changing of spelling. It is rather broader. It is rather deeper level in which the truth is challenged. The whole concept of Eurocentric notion of truth is challenged by this process of appropriation. Now, once again, looking at the background, during the colonization, the colonizers used English language as an instrument of control to set their supremacy, established a power hierarchy based on the linguistic superiority by suppressing all the native tongues. These native tongues were proved by the European colonizers to be insufficient, to be uncivilized dictums. But the writer of the post-colonial world have challenged this hegemonic power of the colonial language and subverted it using their very own language. This is now we can say ironic treatment of the European or the English language. First, it was basically introduced by the colonizer, but later when they gain the political independence or when they become educated in this language, they use this very language, this English language, to pinpoint the flaws, the shortcomings, the we can say gaps in the European notions regarding the basic concept of truth or justice or even civilization. Now, in the essay Imaginary Homelands, Salman Rushdie very famously points out, we can't simply use the language the way the British did. It needs remaking for our own purposes. Almost what Raja Rao has pointed out in Kanthapura, Salman Rushdie is once again highlighting this aspect that we need to use English language, but according to our makes. To conquer English, maybe to complete the process of making ourselves free. How great this declaration is that we have to conquer English also. Now, conquering English means we should reject, that is abrogation, the syntax, and second thing is we should introduce our own idioms, our own point of view that will be a complete conquering of the colonizer's language. Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths and Helen Tiffin describe a two-part process through which the writers in the post-colonial world displace a standard language and replace it with a local variant. Now these two terms, one we have already discussed, abrogation, and second is accommodation or appropriation. We have already seen abrogation is a refusal of the standard of normative or correct usage of English and its assumption of a traditional and fixed meaning inscribed in the words. We have already seen it. It is completely refusal to accept that your English is the only English. It is just like raising the slogan, we have our own English. The authors are careful to point out, Ashcroft and other authors are careful to point out, abrogation alone, though it is important in decolonizing process, decolonizing the dominant language, it is alone not sufficient because it is very, we can say it has a little effect. How many words or meanings or syntax you can change? Consequently, the post-colonial theorists have moved on a new stance. It is a stance of appropriation and accommodation from that of abrogation and aggression. Because appropriation is on a broader and deeper level. It takes this language completely according to their own cultural, their own society, their own mythical backgrounds. Appropriation in this actually in this way is the process by which the language is adopted as a tool and utilized to express widely differing cultural experiences. Now, it is a sort of hybridization, an act of agency and freedom where the writer creatively uses English. Creatively means he doesn't find or she doesn't find himself confined to a particular vocab, particular syntax, but the writer uses this particular English according to the writer's idiom, writer's need, to show how the crucial weapon of colonization, that is English language, can become a weapon of post-colonial as well. This is the irony. Now, this shift from abrogation to appropriation marks a move from unlearning English, that is abrogation, that is changing the spellings or having a, we can say, shift with grammar, but now it means project of learning how to curse in the master's tongue. You can see the irony in this very phrase. They have taught us English, now we curse them in their own language. So, when a post-colonialist writer writes in English to expose the Eurocentric point of view, to make fun of the flaws of the imperial society, to mock their manners and belief, the writer is appropriating the colonizer's language for his or her own advantage. This is what appropriation is known as. Okay, now we come to two other terms. The first is hybridity. Once again, this word basically, which literally means an offspring of two different ideas that have been mixed up. It is basically a scientific term which is used in botany and later in other spheres of science also. But post-colonial scholars used it as a metaphor to convey the nature, a very complex nature of colonizer and colonized relationship. In scientific experiment, the result of hybridization are almost sure, but in a social hybridization between the Western colonizer and the Eastern colonized, the result is not so, we can say, definite or easily described. It is a very complex relationship. First, it was the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz who used this term hybrid to demonstrate amalgamation of different groups in Cuba and how the marginal groups appropriate materials conveyed to them by a governing culture, thereby such transcultural resulting in hybridity. There is basically, we can say, a center which decides what is valid, what is legible, what is allowed, and on the margins there are various groups. Now when these various groups come across the, we can say, appropriation of material, they make their own use of it, and it is kind of transculturalization between the center and the periphery, and it results in the hybridity. Hybridity is a contact zone, contact between a liminal layer, a contact between two, we can say, different spheres, a unique space where unlike cultures, native and the foreign culture meet, clash, grapple with each other, often in highly lopsided relation of domination and subordination. For a long time, this meeting, this clash meant that the colonizer had heavy hand. The colonizer was able to dominate and in some cases completely wiped out the colonized culture. Later, Homi Bhabha, who is an eminent post-colonial scholar, he used this term as a key concept in post-colonial discourse. In his book, The Location of Culture, he states, if the jargon of our time, post-modernity, post-coloniality, post-feminism, has any meaning at all, it doesn't lie in the popular use of the post, which only indicates sequentiality, means post after. But he says no, these terms have only embodied restless and revisionary energy. These terms will have meaning only if they transform the present into an expanded, eccentric site of experience and empowerment. This eccentric is very important. It means that taking something from center to the periphery. This movement, this mixture is very important in whole post-colonial and postmodern discourse. Bhabha considers hybridity would deconstruct the binaries and interrupts the presumed borders between colonizer and colonized, east and west, self and other. Such kind of binary division, such kind of dichotomy, they have to be done away with. They have to be destruct. They have to be deconstruct in order to understand the real complex nature of relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Now, hybridity has been employed in post-colonial discourse to imply simply cross-cultural exchange and the affinity of cultures. And Bhabha says that it is unnecessary to go back to the pre-colonial tradition. Now, after political and independence, there are many scholars who say that we need to clean up all the empire's signs. We have to re-establish the pre-colonial pristine stage, but Bhabha consider it to be both unnecessary and unfeasible. He says that hybridity of post-colonial culture itself proved to be anti-colonial. This hybridization, it doesn't mean impurity for the culture. It is also anti-colonial. It is also a form of resistance and decolonization. Hybridity is an advantage for the post-colonial writers and critics to examine the West both as the insider as well the outsider. Outsider because we are not the integral part of that culture. Insider because we have seen them firsthand. So we can critically analyze their culture. Hybridity thus gives us an assenting answer, a yes to Gayatri Spivak's seminal question, can the subaltern speak? According to Bhabha, yes, they can speak because of their hybrid experience. The post-colonial writer proved, despite gaining independence, they lucratively made the colonizers' language as a medium for the creative expression, which we have already seen in the sense of abrogation and appropriation. A very correlated term with hybridity is mimicry, and it is one of key terms of post-colonial discourse. Mimicry describes the ambivalent relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. In fact, to establish their supremacy, colonial discourse persuade the colonized people to mimic the colonizer by following the colonizer's cultural habit, manners, societies and principles. When they first settled themselves as the colonizers, and they wanted the native people to imitate them, to copy their culture, so that their native culture can be proved to be uncivilized, under-civilized, or to be insufficiently civilized. The main purpose behind this desire to make the native follow their custom was to show the supremacy of the West, or to we can say propagate the Eurocentric vision of the world. But when the members of a colonized society, Indians or Africans, when they begin to imitate the language, dress, politics or cultural attitude of their colonizer, the outcome is not a very simple reproduction of these qualities. We can, to understand this concept, we can take a metaphor. They wanted a mirror image, but instead of mirror image, instead of totally blindly copying them, mimicry results in a blurred copy of the colonizer, and this blurred copy can be quite intimidating for the colonizer. He is horrified to see the result. In fact, British wanted to form a class of Indians, if we take example of India, who should approve English opinion and moral standards of what can be called mimic man. It is title of very famous work by S Naipaul, in which he criticizes this tendency of the diaspora community that they all are mimic men. They use all the cultural codes of the colonizers. Early post-colonial scholars saw mimicry as something shameful which we should not follow, and a black or brown person engaging in mimicry was usually derided. A very common example you can see yourself in a number of Indian movies and serials and other media channels. A person who is shown as a westernized product, he is generally made fun of. He is basically shown as what we say adha adhura gyan. He is made fun of, he is shown his place, she is shown his place, whether it is in use of English language or English manners. Mimicry is frequently invoked with reference to being to. Another important phrase used by Frantz Fanon. Someone who has traveled to the West, then returned home, seemingly completely transformed. This journey has transformed. This journey from native to the foreign land and becoming like a foreigner. Frantz Fanon mocked the affected pretentiousness of the Martinicians people, being twos who have been to the West, in his book Black Skin, White Mask. Later, Homi K Bhabha, he basically considers this phenomena of mimicry from a very different and positive perspective. In his essay of Mimicry and Man, Bhabha describes mimicry sometimes unintentionally subversive. Even when the mimic man is not knowing, he or she may be subverting the colonizer, the original. The mimic man in relation to the colonizer, this is the most important phrase, almost the same but not quite, because he cannot, we can say, imbibe all cultural code, all linguistic nuances, all social background, and neither he or she can completely forsake, desert, forget their nativity. It is what Bhabha feels as a basis of anti-colonial resistance. If an Indian desiring to mimic the English becomes obsessed with some particular cultural codes associated with the Englishness, we can take so many examples which we have copied from the Victorian England, like having tea in china cups, preferring spoons and forks in restaurant instead of eating with hands, or wearing we can say warm suits. These all are examples of trying to copy cultural codes associated with Englishness, but the performance of the mimic man might show how hollow the codes really are, how they are completely disassociated with the values which they were supposed to be. It is because of such performance the effect of mimicry on the authority of colonial discourse is profound and disturbing. The colonizer itself is shocked to see the performance of the mimic man. So basically, mimicry is paradoxical in its nature. The colonizer wants that its subject should copy and follow the colonizer's code of conduct, but at the same time, when colonizers begin to mimic them, the colonizer becomes apprehensive because it will destroy the wall of difference between them. What will be the difference then between the colonizer and the colonized if they both follow the same cultural code? For example, if the colonizer British man drinks tea in a china cup and the colonized Indian also drinks tea in a china cup, how can the Britisher, the colonizer, will establish its superiority over the colonized? For the colonizer, mimicry by the colonized subject is both desirable at one point, but later it becomes a menace. Mimicry is thus an ambivalent strategy where subaltern people simultaneously express their subservience, their slavery to the more powerful, and at the same time they subvert that power by making mimicry seems like mockery. Apart from writing fiction in English, the colonizers' language, we can see in this in other forms also. The call centers in India getting job orders from the West, thus eating out their employment, is another example. Reverse mimicry is another related concept in which the colonizer tries to copy certain cultural and social codes of the colonized. Sometimes mimicry happens in the reverse order. Instead of colonized following the colonizer's code, the colonizer or the European, they are fascinated, they are attracted by certain native practices and they want to follow it. This is known as reverse mimicry. The earliest example of this kind of reverse mimicry might be considered example of Oriental scholars like Richard Burton, who often attempted to disguise himself as an Arab or an Indian during his time as a colonial administrator. In literature, there are also many examples like Rudyard Kipling's Kim, where Kipling invents a white child who grows up wild, as it were, on the streets of Lahore outside the reach of British society. Another telling example is that of yoga or meditation practices or feng shui or Chinese martial art. In many of the action movies, they are example of reverse imagery. So friends, this was a discussion on some key terms of post-colonial discourse. I hope I was able to make my points clear. If you have any doubt or any query, please either message me on WhatsApp or put it on your YouTube channel. Thank you, dear friends, for your continuous support.